Chapter 1. The First Stillness. The rain in Quel'Thalas wasn't a cleansing downpour, not anymore. It was a thin, persistent weeping, a lament that mirrored the growing unease in the heart of Silverleaf. It hadn't always been this way. For centuries, the forest had pulsed with a vibrant, almost palpable magic, a symphony conducted by the Sunwell's unwavering light. Now, the symphony was fracturing. Lord Caelan Forwind, Ranger Lord of the Emerald Guard, shifted his weight, the damp leather of his armor clinging uncomfortably to his skin. Had been tracking the source of the disturbance for 3 days, a knot of cold dread tightening with each step deeper into the corrupted heart of the forest. He hadn't expected to find this beautiful, horrifying stillness. The air itself felt viscous, thick with a silence that pressed against his ears, a silence born not of absence, but of an actively consuming presence. The usual rustle of leaf, the chirp of the iridescent sky moths, even the low murmur of the Silverleaf streams all gone. Only the steady, agonizing drip of the rain broke the unnerving quiet. Around him, the once pristine expanse of the Silverleaf wasrong. The trees, tall and graceful even in death, stood frozen mid-motion, their silver bark gleaming with an unnatural sheen. They were perfectly still, impossibly so, as if caught in the final heartbreaking chord of a celestial lament. And then he saw them, the statues. They were elves. Not the crumbling, weathered remnants of forgotten battles, but living elves, frozen mid-action, exquisitely rendered in crystalline ice. A mage, his hands raised in a gesture of complex conjuration, his face a mask of serene horror. A scout, poised with a longbow, his eyes wide with a silent, inescapable fear. A healer, her hand outstretched in a futile attempt to mend a phantom wound. Each one was a breathtaking, agonizingly detailed sculpture of perfection, coated in a shimmering, brittle frost. They weren't merely frozen, they the hollow song. By the ancestors, he murmured, drawing his longsword, the cold steel a small comfort against the suffocating dread. It's worse than we feared. He wasn't alone. Across the clearing, bathed in the pale, filtered light, stood Lyra Sunstone, a Sun-Fury Arcanist of considerable renown. Her robes, woven with threads of solidified sunlight, seemed to recoil in the unsettling stillness. And the glow of her personal sunstone, usually a beacon of warmth and power, flickered weakly. Her face was etched with a grim understanding. "The echoes are amplified, Caelan," she said, her voice a strained whisper, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. Traditional spellcasting jets feeding it. Each burst of arcane energy, each attempt to control the distortion, only strengthens the song's hold. Caelan sheathed his sword, a weary gesture. "Then we discard the expected." He gestured to the statues. "Our greatest strength, our magic, is the enemy. We've been fighting with fire, and the Songit consumes fire." Lyra approached cautiously, examining one of the frozen mages. Her fingers, normally radiating with heat, felt numb with a chilling cold. The crystals, they aren't natural. They are by the song. It's feeding on the inherent resonance of our magic, transforming it into this crystalline prison. She pulled a small, intricately carved obsidian shard from her pouch, a focusing tool for her most delicate rituals. "I've been trying to analyze the song's structure, its harmonics. It's chaotic, unnatural, unlike anything I've encountered in all my years of study. It seems to be derived from a void star, a remnant of the Scourge's corruption, a dissonant echo of oblivion." "A dead star," Caelan repeated, the words tasting like ash. "It's not just destroying us, it's twisting us, making us of its horror." He observed the other statues, noticing a subtle, rhythmic pulsing within the crystalline structures. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, that resonated deep within his bones. It wasn't a physical tremor, it was a sensation, an insistent, insidious lure, promising solace in the oblivion. The elders spoke of a ritual, Lyra said, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. The silence of the stars. A severance from all magic, a deliberate deafness to the song. It's a desperate measure, a return to a state of primal sensitivity. It risks stripping us of everything that makes us elves, but it's our only hope. The concept was chilling. To willingly relinquish their connection to the Sunwell, to their very essence, felt like a form of death. But as Kalen looked around at the frozen beauty of the Silverleaf, at the silent testament to the song's power, he realized they were already beyond death. "It's a gamble," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "A terrifying one. But we have no other choice." The first, unsettling stillness of Quel'Thalas had become a chilling prophecy, a requiem for a race consumed by the echoes of a forgotten void. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. The air in the Silverleaf Grove hung thick with a dreadful, muted stillness. Even the rustle of the leaves, a constant, comforting murmur under normal circumstances, had vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet that pressed against the ears like a physical weight. Kalen, Ranger Lord of Quel'Thalas, stood amidst the crystalline statues, dozens of his brethren frozen in perfect silent postures, their eyes reflecting the spectral glow of the corrupted Sunwell. Each one was a stark monument to a failing, a beautiful, agonizing death. Lyra, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, moved with a frantic grace, meticulously charting the distribution of the crystalline formations. Her fingers, normally crackling with raw arcane energy, were stained a sickly gray from the residual residue of the hollow song. "The pulse is strongest here," she announced, her voice hushed, almost reverent. "It's concentrated, almost like the song is anchoring itself to this particular node of corrupted energy." Kalen observed her, his own senses acutely strained. He could still feel the insidious pull of the song. A cold, insistent whisper urging him to surrender, to simply bite. It wasn't a sound he could hear with his ears, but one that resonated directly within his soul, promising an end to the relentless, horrifying awareness of their unraveling. The sensation was more than just unsettling. It was a profound existential dread, the terrifying knowledge of nothingness offered with seductive ease. The elders' records were remarkably vague on the specifics of the ritual, Lyra continued, pulling out a brittle, leather-bound tome. Only fragmented passages, warnings layered with superstition. It speaks of a temporal severance, a complete cessation of magical affinity. They believed it would act as a shield, a buffer against the song's influence. "Shields are predicated on something to defend against," Kalen countered, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his cold iron blade. "The song isn't a fortress, it's a virus. It's rewriting our very being, turning us into instruments of its amplification." He understood, with a chilling clarity, that their attempts to combat the song with conventional magic had been disastrous, feeding the entity's power and accelerating the transformation. The Sunwell, the source of their strength, was being subtly, irrevocably corrupted, its radiant energy warped into a perverse mimicry of the void. "The theoretical framework exists," Lyra said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But the practical application, it's unlike anything we've ever encountered. We've experimented with dampened runes, psychic barriers. Nothing disrupts the song's resonance. This requires a complete void." The idea was terrifying. To consciously extinguish their connection to the Sunwell, the very source of their immortality, their magic, felt akin to ceasing to be. It was a sacrifice of everything they were, a descent into an unnerving state of primal awareness, stripped bare of the sophisticated filters of their elven minds. "We'll need to gather the necessary components," Kalen said, his voice firm, a deliberate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos. Specifically, obsidian shards from the Shadowfell, refined with lunar silver. The elders also spoke of a focusing crystal, a prism of compressed starlight, rare even amongst the Silverleaf. The task felt impossibly daunting. The Shadowfell was a realm of perpetual twilight, a festering wound in reality, teeming with horrors far beyond the reach of conventional weaponry. Obtaining obsidian there would be a trial in itself, and the prism of starlight that was a legend, a myth whispered by ancient mages, a shard of a fallen star, imbued with the raw power of creation. As they worked, a small contingent of elven warriors, led by the grizzled veteran, Master Alatar, arrived, carrying a wagon laden with cold iron arrowheads. "We've been reinforcing the barricades," Alatar said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "The song seems to be attracting things. Shadows that cling to the edges of perception. It's unsettling, even for a hardened veteran." Kalen didn't bother to respond, his attention focused on Lyra as she painstakingly prepared the focusing crystal, a meticulously crafted sphere of iridescent quartz, humming with a faint, trapped light. He recognized the immense pressure bearing down on them. They were fighting a battle not against a physical enemy, but against the very essence of their being. "The silence will be absolute," Lyra said, her voice strained. "No thought, no sensation, no memory, nothing. It will be oblivion." Kalen looked at the statues again, at the frozen faces of his kin, each a testament to the horrifying beauty of their imminent demise. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Then, let us embrace it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let us offer this oblivion to the song, and break its hold upon Quel'Thalas." The weight of silence, of willingly sacrificing their very selves, settled upon him, a terrifying, yet strangely compelling, promise. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Void. The silence descended with a sickening grace. It wasn't abrupt, like a snapped spell, or the crashing of a wave. It was a gradual fading, a thinning of the air around them, as if the world itself was politely withdrawing its attention. Kalen felt the last vestiges of warmth leach from his skin, the subtle throb of his heartbeat receding into a distant muted rhythm. Lyra's crystal pulsed with a brighter intensity, drawing the encroaching darkness inwards, a desperate, fragile beacon. Around them, the statues remained, frozen in expressions of bewildered horror, their crystalline forms shimmering with an unsettling, internal light. The rhythmic pulse of the hollow song, once a suffocating pressure, now existed only as a phantom vibration within their skulls, a dull ache where sensation had been. It was profoundly disconcerting, this absence, a reminder of their own vanished selves. Master Alatar, predictably, was the first to articulate the unsettling truth. He wasn't the song anymore, not in the way they had. Instead, he was acutely aware of its residue, a cold, brittle awareness of its vastness, its alien intelligence. "It's not listening to us," he rasped, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "It's simply calculating. It's grown bored, I think." His observation was punctuated by a shift in the surrounding forest. The shadows clinging to the periphery, the creatures drawn to the song's dissonance, weren't gone, but had retreated further, circling with a predatory patience. They were not hostile, exactly, but utterly devoid of purpose beyond their silent, watchful observation. Kalen realized with a chilling certainty that they were not fighting a monster, but a process of slow, deliberate corruption of reality itself. Lyra, despite the obvious strain, continued her work, meticulously adjusting the focusing crystal. The quartz sphere responded to her movements with a hypnotic shimmer, drawing the remaining echoes of the hollow song into its core. The air thickened with a palpable tension, and Kalen felt a strange tightening in his chest, a phantom pang of regret for the lost sensations, the memories threatened by this enforced oblivion. "The duration?" he prompted, his voice strained and formal, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control in this dissolving reality. "How long before the localized vibration is achieved?" Lyra paused, her hand hovering over the crystal. "The calculations are uncertain. The song resists containment. It's feeding on the effort, amplifying its influence. I estimate 30 cycles, 30 rotations of the crystal before the resonance reaches critical mass ID. 30 rotations. A terrifyingly short span of time. The arrival of reinforcements was a jarring note in the unsettling quiet. A contingent of elven warriors, clad in polished steel and bearing the banner of House Viridian, moved into position, their movements precise and deadly. They were a pragmatic, battle-hardened force, accustomed to brutal efficiency. Their commander, a stern woman named Seraphina, offered a curt nod to Kalen and Lyra, her face etched with a grim determination. "Well, provide cover," she stated, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "Keep those shadows at bay. This ritual demands absolute focus." Kalen acknowledged her with a brief, almost automatic gesture. He didn't need to speak. The unspoken agreement hung heavy in the air. They were alone against an entity of unimaginable power. A power that sought to unravel not just their bodies, but their very souls. As Lyra completed her final adjustment, the crystal pulsed with a blinding white light. The localized vibration began, a subtle tremor that resonated not in their ears, but deep within their bones. The shadows around the statues intensified, coalescing into vaguely humanoid forms that writhed with silent, tormented energy. "Now!" Kalen shouted, his voice a ragged plea against the overwhelming silence. With practiced movements, the elven warriors unleashed their cold iron arrows. They weren't imbued with magic, but with a deliberately engineered chaos, a disruptive force designed to shatter the crystalline core. The arrows struck with a jarring impact, each one finding its mark with unsettling precision. The crystalline core of the focusing crystal began to fracture, sending shards of iridescent quartz scattering across the forest floor. The hollow song wailed, no longer a rhythmic pressure, but a discordant shriek of pain and rage. The shadows recoiled, dissolving back into the periphery as the vibration intensified. As the last shard shattered, a palpable release swept through the clearing. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by a fragile, hesitant whisper, the sound of the Quel'Thalas forest, returning. It wasn't the familiar, vibrant song of life and magic, but a muted echo, a tentative return to order. Kalen felt the warmth slowly return to his skin, the familiar throb of his heartbeat intensifying. He was whole again, but profoundly changed. He was aware of the immense cost of their victory, the sacrifices made in the embrace of oblivion. Looking at the statues, now dull and lifeless, he understood. They weren't just symbols of death, they were monuments to a lost possibility, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of those who sought to understand and harness the power of magic. And he knew with a sickening certainty that the hollow song, though silenced, would not be forgotten. It had merely retreated, waiting for the opportune moment to begin again. Chapter 4. Echoes in the stone. The rain began subtly, a fine gray mist that clung to the shattered remains of the focusing crystal, coating the iridescent shards with a slick film. It felt less like a cleansing and more like a lament, each drop a tiny, mournful note added to the lingering echo of the hollow song. Kalen, still reeling from the abrupt return of his senses, stood at the edge of the clearing, the chill of the rain a physical manifestation of the grief that threatened to consume him. The statues remained, 12 silent witnesses to a horror they couldn't comprehend, their faces frozen in an eternal, unnerving stillness. Anya, The Sun-Fury Arcanist approached him, her movements measured, almost ritualistic. She was meticulous, as always, examining the scattered shards with a strange intensity, her golden eyes reflecting the gray light. "The resonance," she murmured, her voice hushed. "It's thinner now. Not entirely gone, but significantly diminished. The song, it sought the structure of our magic, the harmonic resonance. Disrupting that, however violently, created a weakness." Quel'Thalas nodded, the weight of her words settling upon him. The silence of the stars. It was the only solution, wasn't it? A deliberate negation, a denial of the very thing that fueled the corruption. He glanced at the statues, a profound sadness twisting his features. "We sacrificed our connection to the Sunwell, our ability to magic, to silence the song. And for what? To momentarily hold back an evil that will inevitably return, subtly, patiently." The realization hung in the air, heavier than the rain. They hadn't extinguished the darkness, they'd merely bought time. A fleeting reprieve at a catastrophic cost. The elves, once so adept at channeling the raw power of the arcane, were now diminished, their senses dulled, their connection to the fundamental currents of magic fractured. "The question remains," Anya said, her voice tinged with a quiet desperation. "How much damage was done? The residual effect, it's not just the song's influence. It's woven into the very fabric of Quel'Thalas now, a discordant thread. I've detected traces of it within the soil. Within the trees, a subtle warping of the natural energies." She reached out, cautiously touching one of the statues. Her fingers lingered on the cold, smooth surface of the crystallized mage, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "These aren't just physical forms, Quel'Thalas. They're amplifiers. The song has imprinted itself upon them, amplifying its effects, potentially attracting further resonances." The Ranger Lord's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his cold iron longsword. Had learned to trust his instincts, and the current silence felt less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. "We need to understand the nature of this resonance. Can it be traced? Can we predict where it will manifest next?" "We can try," Anya replied, pulling out a small, intricately crafted device of silver and quartz, a refinement of the instruments used to detect the initial distortion. "But it's unsettling. The device registers a constant, almost imperceptible vibration, not emanating from the statues themselves, but them. It's as if the song isn't simply existing. It's..." They began to move, cautiously navigating the devastated clearing, the rain intensifying. Quel'Thalas noticed the movements of the remaining elves, a silent, somber procession. Elder Elara, her face etched with a lifetime of knowledge and sorrow, moved slowly amongst them, offering words of comfort, of reassurance, of acceptance. But her eyes betrayed a profound weariness, the recognition of a truth too terrible to fully articulate. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the signs of the hollow song's influence became more pronounced. The trees themselves seemed to lean towards one another, their branches twisted into unnatural angles. The scent of pine and damp earth was overlaid with a subtle metallic tang, a phantom echo of the crystalline corruption. They discovered a small grove where a circle of young elves, their faces slack and vacant, had begun to crystallize, their forms frozen in poses of quiet terror. "They were listening," Anya whispered, her voice choked with anguish. "The song lured them in, promising knowledge, promising understanding. It exploited their innate curiosity, their desire to delve into the mysteries of magic." Quel'Thalas stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for his bow. He didn't see an immediate threat, but he felt it a presence, subtle yet undeniably malevolent, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the potential for horror. He looked back at the statues, at the silent monuments to their sacrifice, and knew. The victory they had achieved wasn't a triumph, but a postponement. The hollow song wasn't gone, merely dormant, waiting for the next attuned ear, the next vulnerable soul, to draw it back into the world. And in the echoing silence of Quel'Thalas, he heard the faintest, most insidious whisper, a promise of return. Chapter 5. The Resonance of Absence. The rain began subtly, a fine, persistent mist that clung to the silverleaf and bone-white stone of Quel'Thalas. It wasn't a cleansing rain, not a deluge to wash away the corruption. It was the rain of resignation, a melancholic drizzle that mirrored the growing despair within Caelan's heart. The grove of crystallized elves lay undisturbed, a chilling testament to their flawed understanding. Anya, ever the pragmatist, was meticulously documenting the scene, sketching the precise angles of the frozen postures, noting the subtle shifts in the crystalline structure. Her youthful face was etched with a seriousness that bordered on grief, a burden she carried with an unnerving calmness. "The rate of crystallization is accelerating," she observed, her charcoal scratching against the parchment. "The Sunwell's influence is weakening, allowing the song's resonance to propagate at an exponential rate. It's feeding on the void created by our absence of magic." Caelan didn't respond. He simply watched the rain, the sound a dull throb against the pervasive silence, a silence that had become the defining characteristic of Quel'Thalas. Head spent the last few hours pacing the perimeter of the grove, a knot of unease tightening with each passing moment. The realization that terrible, inescapable truth settled upon him with the weight of a tombstone. They hadn't simply failed to combat the hollow song, they had inadvertently its instrument. "The ritual," he said, his voice rough. "The silence of the stars. It's not a solution, Anya. It's an admission of our vulnerability." Anya paused her sketching, her dark eyes fixed on him. "It's a tactic, Caelan. A desperate one, granted, but a tactic nonetheless. We've exhausted our conventional defenses. The song rejects magic. We are left with nothing but our awareness, our connection to this land. If we can sever that connection, even temporarily, we can disrupt the song's flow. Disrupt it for how long?" Caelan countered, the bitterness laced into his tone. "A few hours? A day? While we're deaf, it will continue to propagate, drawing in more souls, building its power. This isn't a victory, it's a stalling maneuver, a slow, agonizing retreat." He moved towards the largest of the crystalline statues, a young male elf frozen mid-leap, his hand outstretched, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. He reached out, touching the cool, smooth surface of the crystal. It pulsed faintly with a light that wasn't light, a vibration that resonated deep within his bones. He could still feel the faintest echo of the song's influence, a seductive whisper attempting to weave itself into his thoughts. "It's not just feeding on magic," he murmured, pulling his hand away. "It's feeding on Tochi, our desire to understand, our yearning for knowledge. It exploits our innate elven traits, twisting them into instruments of destruction." The Sun-Fury Arcanist, Lyra, materialized silently beside him, her silver armor gleaming faintly in the rain. She held a meticulously crafted, cold iron arrow, its tip honed to an impossibly fine edge. "We need to move quickly. The rate of crystallization is exceeding our capacity to observe and react. The Elder Council has authorized the ritual. We must proceed." Lyra's voice lacked the usual urgency, replaced by a quiet, almost fatalistic acceptance. She was a scholar, a keeper of ancient knowledge, and she seemed to carry the weight of understanding with a particular solemnity. "The historical accounts are unsettling," she admitted, adjusting the arrow. "The silence of the stars has been used before, during a similar crisis centuries ago. But the results were always incomplete. The song always returns, though perhaps in a different form." The preparations began, a slow, deliberate process dictated by ancient rituals. The remaining elves gathered, their faces drawn and pale, their movements measured and precise. They began to chant, a low guttural drone that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of Quel'Thalas. The air grew thick with a strange energy, a palpable sense of dread. As they entered the deeper stages of the ritual, Kalen felt a profound disconnect, not just from magic, but from himself. It was a sensation akin to drowning, a gradual erasure of identity as the world around him faded into a monochrome void. The rain intensified, washing over him, not cleansing, but smothering. When the final incantation was spoken, a wave of profound silence descended. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, it was the absence of horror. They were, for all intents and purposes, deaf, blind, and numb. Lyra unleashed a volley of cold iron arrows, each one tipped with a perfectly formed shard of crystal harvested from the crystallized elves. They struck the crystalline core with brutal precision, creating a localized vibration, a fracturing of the song's resonance. The silence intensified then with a sound like the snapping of 1,000 bones. The core shattered. As the last fragments of the crystalline heart disintegrated, a faint whisper returned. Not the seductive lure of the hollow song, but a raw elemental whisper, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of water, the sigh of the wind. Quel'Thalas was breathing again, but Kalen knew with chilling certainty that the silence wasn't broken. It was merely contained, waiting for the next resonant ear. Chapter 6. Echoes in the gray. The re-emergence of the natural world was a brutal, almost violent beauty. Quel'Thalas, stripped bare of its shimmering enchantments, resembled a landscape sculpted from grief. The silverleaf trees, once vibrant with protective wards, were now coated in a perpetual sullen gray, their branches skeletal against a bruised, perpetually overcast sky. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying crystal, tasted of loss. Kalen remained rooted to the spot. Not from physical exhaustion, the silence had left him profoundly devoid of sensation, but from a lingering, icy dread. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, the rain continuing its relentless, smothering wash. The initial disorientation had begun to recede, replaced by a pervasive, unsettling calm. It wasn't peace, it was a vacant, utterly unnerving stillness. He felt hollowed. Lyra's presence, a reassuring warmth against the pervasive chill, was barely registered. She moved with a practiced efficiency, directing the remaining elves, a small, exhausted cohort of survivors, towards the damaged Sunwell. The Sunwell, once a roaring testament to their civilization's arcane power, was now a fractured obsidian ruin. The air around it pulsed with a faint, sickly residue, a lingering echo of the hollow song's corruption. Even without magic, Kalen could it. A subtle dissonant hum vibrating deep within his bones. It wasn't the seductive promise of the song anymore, but a deep, unsettling awareness of its lingering potential. The energy readings are stable, Ranger Lord. Lyra's voice, flat and measured, broke the silence. It was a voice stripped of inflection, honed to its bare function. The immediate threat has been neutralized, but the residue, it's different. It's older. She gestured towards a cluster of newly formed crystalline formations, smaller than those that had entombed the mages, but pulsing with the same disturbing light. These are not direct manifestations of the song. They're echoes, residual resonances, trapped within the shattered heart of the Sunwell. They crave amplification. Kalen forced himself to acknowledge her words, an effort that felt profoundly unnatural. His mind, accustomed to the constant flow of magical information, struggled to grasp the concept of residual resonance. It was a concept rooted in a physical absence, a space filled not with power, but with power, a terrifying prospect. "We must contain them," he finally managed, the words feeling clumsy, foreign on his tongue. "Prevent them from gathering strength." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. The initial attempts to weave wards proved futile. The resonance itself disrupts the flow, feeds upon the effort. We need a different approach, something less reliant on magic. They began to meticulously gather stones, gray, brittle fragments of Quel'Thalas itself, and arrange them around the Sunwell in a complex geometric pattern. It wasn't a ward exactly, but a cage, designed to dampen the resonance, to force the echoes into a more manageable form. The process was agonizingly slow, each stone requiring precise placement, each movement a deliberate act of suppression. As they worked, Kaelin observed the other elves. Some were lost, adrift in the silent haze, exhibiting symptoms of extended exposure to the silence. They moved with a vacant grace, their eyes staring blankly ahead, their faces etched with a horrifying neutrality. He realized then, with a chilling certainty, that the silence hadn't simply removed their magical abilities, it had fundamentally altered their perceptions, their very sense of self. "It's not about silencing the song," he murmured to Lyra. The words a desperate attempt to articulate the horrifying truth. It's about understanding it. It learned to mimic our voices, our desires, our fears. It didn't destroy us, it us. Lyra paused, her hand hovering over a particularly unstable crystal shard. "You're suggesting a counter-resonance? An active engagement with the song, rather than outright negation?" A desperate gamble, Kaelin admitted, feeling a tremor of something akin to fear ripple through his consciousness. "But if the song feeds on harmony, perhaps disruption, controlled dissonance, could weaken it. We need to introduce a specific pattern, a counter-melody to interrupt its own." He began to subtly manipulate the arrangement of the stones, creating a series of interlocking angles, a rudimentary, almost instinctive pattern. It wasn't a beautiful melody. It was a jagged, uncomfortable discord, a deliberate attempt to introduce chaos into the song's ordered resonance. As he did, the crystalline formations around the Sunwell began to pulse with increased intensity, their light growing brighter, their silence more profound. The air thickened, pressing against him with an almost physical weight. Kaelin realized with stark horror that his actions weren't weakening the song, they were amplifying it, feeding its hunger. The rain intensified once more, not cleansing, but a cold, insistent reminder of their isolation. The silence was not broken. It had simply evolved, becoming a more potent, more insidious form of imprisonment. And Kaelin, standing within its gray embrace, knew, with absolute certainty, that the battle for Quel'Thalas was not won. It had merely begun, in a place far more terrifying than any battlefield, within the heart of a silent, receptive mind. Chapter 7. The Echo in the Stone. The rain continued its relentless assault on Quel'Thalas, a frigid gray curtain obscuring the dying light. It wasn't the rain of cleansing, of rebirth, that Kaelin had instinctively hoped for. This was a rain of judgment, each drop a tiny bitter note added to the suffocating symphony of the hollow song. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the entity's presence, a pressure that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. His initial instinct, the counter-resonance, had proven to be a monstrous miscalculation. He hadn't weakened the song head become its amplifier, a willing instrument in its grotesque dance. He backed away from the stone arrangement, the jagged angles now a stark, unsettling testament to his folly. The crystalline statues surrounding the Sunwell pulsed with an unholy luminescence, casting dancing, distorted shadows that writhed like phantom figures. The silence was no longer simply the absence of sound, it was a concentrated awareness that felt like 1,000 needles probing his mind. He could almost the corruption, a metallic tang overlaid with the phantom scent of petrichor, twisted and decayed. It's not a question of disrupting its flow, he muttered, his voice strained, barely audible above the driving rain. It's a question of understanding it flows. This isn't a river, it's a wound. He turned to Lyra, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, who stood rigid, her silver eyes fixed on the intensifying light. She hadn't moved since his disastrous experiment, her face a mask of grim determination. The ritual, she said, her voice a low, carefully modulated drone, the silence of the stars. It's predicated on total cessation. We were aiming for a blank slate. What you created, it demanded a response. It craved engagement. Kalen nodded, the chilling realization settling upon him. The song wasn't a passive infection, it was a predator, actively seeking out resonant frequencies, feeding upon the very essence of their being. The Sunwell. It's not merely a conduit. It's a key. The hollow star isn't just it's amplifying its own discordant signature through the Sunwell's inherent magic. He moved with a newfound urgency, abandoning the fragmented stone arrangement. He needed to isolate the source to find the nexus where the song's influence was most potent. He examined the Sunwell's basin, a circular pool of shimmering, corrupted water, and a growing sense of dread washed over him. The water wasn't just distorted, it was actively the song, echoing its horrifying melody within its depths. We need to dampen the Sunwell's resonance, he said, his voice raspy. Force it to hold its breath. He reached for a pouch of finely ground selenite, a stone known for its ability to absorb magical energies. It was a desperate measure, a crude attempt to interfere with the Sunwell's inherent song, but it was all they had left. As he scattered the selenite across the water's surface, a visible wave of distortion rippled outwards, momentarily eclipsing the crystalline glow. For a brief, glorious moment, the relentless pressure in his mind eased. He felt a flicker of hope, a fragile possibility that they might still salvage this situation. But the song responded with brutal efficiency. The water began to churn violently, the selenite dissolving instantly, its power devoured by the entity's insatiable hunger. From the depths of the Sunwell, a new, sharper note emerged, a high-pitched, keening wail that resonated directly within Kalen's skull, forcing him to his knees. Lyra, reacting with a speed that belied her normally serene composure, unleashed a controlled burst of sunlight from her hands, channeling her arcane energy into a focused beam. The beam struck the surface of the Sunwell, attempting to counter the song's influence with raw, purifying light. It was met with an immediate and terrifying backlash. The light fractured, scattering into shimmering shards, and the song intensified, becoming a wall of sound that pressed against them, threatening to overwhelm their minds. "It's learning," Lyra shouted, her voice strained. "It's learning too." Kalen understood then. The hollow song wasn't merely a corruption, it was a sentient entity, a predatory intelligence born from the void. And it wasn't simply feeding on harmony, it was evolving, adapting, becoming increasingly dangerous with every note it absorbed. The silence of the stars remained a distant, almost mythical goal, and the fate of Quel'Thalas hung precariously in the balance, suspended within the suffocating silence of a mind determined to consume them all. The rain continued to fall, washing away any illusion of hope, leaving only the cold, hard certainty of a battle already lost. Chapter 8. Echoes of Consumption. The rain intensified, no longer a gentle lament, but a relentless assault mirroring the relentless pressure of the hollow song. It hammered against the polished obsidian of the Sunwell, a distorted rhythm now, a cruel percussion against the desperate efforts of the surviving elves. Kalen felt it less as a physical force, and more as a profound, insidious erosion of his mind, a gradual unraveling of his awareness. Lyra, usually a beacon of calm control, was visibly frayed, her silver eyes darting with a frantic, almost panicked calculation. The sunlight she channeled was now a strained, flickering ember, barely a defense against the song's escalating power. "It's mocking us," she choked out, her voice ragged. It's enjoying the chaos." The words hung in the air, heavier than the suffocating silence that had begun to settle upon Quel'Thalas. Kalen, despite the agonizing throb behind his eyes, forced himself to focus. He ran a hand over the pommel of his cold iron sword. The familiar chill a grounding presence in the swirling vortex of disorientation. The Ranger Lord's training hadn't prepared him for a battle waged against a mind, against something that actively sought to rewrite reality through sound. "The initial reaction was predictable," he stated, his voice a low, measured counterpoint to the escalating cacophony. "Applying raw magic only fueled its growth. We're fighting a reflection of ourselves, amplified by our very attempts to combat it." He paused, considering the implications. "Lyra, we need to shift our strategy. No more direct attacks. We need to observe, to understand how it's manipulating the environment, how it's learning to weaponize the song itself." Lyra, after a moment of disoriented observation, reluctantly agreed. The fractured remnants of her sunlight beams sputtered and died, leaving a lingering scent of ozone and burnt petals. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. "The silence of the starsets a desperate gambit, Kalen. Severing our connection to the Sunwell entirely? It's akin to death. It's, the only path we have," he replied, his gaze fixed on the crystalline statues that dotted the forest floor. Each one, a tragic monument to the song's influence, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, broadcasting the unsettling melody with unwavering precision. The ritual isn't about simply deafness. It's about creating a vacuum, a space where the song cannot find sustenance. We have to make ourselves to it. The logistical challenges were immense. Maintaining a complete severance from the Sunwell, a source that had sustained their magic for millennia, was a profoundly unsettling concept. It represented a fundamental rejection of their very nature. Yet, the alternative, a slow, agonizing assimilation into the song, was unthinkable. "We begin preparations immediately," Kalen ordered, signaling to the remaining Sun-Fury Arcanists. They moved with practiced efficiency, distributing small, intricate devices woven from silver and obsidian. These were anchors, designed to dampen the flow of residual magic, creating pockets of localized nullification around the remaining elves. It was a crude, temporary measure, but it was all they had. As the last of the anchors were deployed, a chilling realization dawned on Kalen. The song wasn't just feeding on the Sunwell's harmony, it was actively the anchors, subtly altering their frequency, twisting their function. The echoes of consumption weren't just destructive, they were intelligent, adaptive. "It's anticipating us," he said, the words laced with grim certainty. "It's not merely responding to our actions. It's them." Suddenly, the rain ceased abruptly. An unnatural stillness descended upon Quel'Thalas, a silence deeper and more profound than the song itself. The crystalline statues pulsed brighter, their internal luminescence coalescing into a single, piercing beam of sound directed at Kalen. It wasn't a chaotic blast of dissonance. It was a precise, calculated note, a miniature symphony of annihilation. He recognized it instantly. It was the fragment of the Void Star's song, the original resonance that had birthed the Hollow Song. It was attempting to unravel his mind, to expose the raw, terrified vulnerability beneath his warrior's exterior. Lyra, anticipating his reaction, acted swiftly. With a desperate prayer to the fading vestiges of the Sunwell's power, she channeled her remaining arcane energy into a different form, not a beam of light, but a complex, layered harmonic resonance designed to disrupt the song's own structure. It wasn't an attack, but a counter-frequency, an attempt to introduce a discordant note into the perfect, horrifying symmetry of the hollow song. The effect was unexpected. The song didn't dissipate. It shifted. It responded, not with aggression, but with a chilling, almost mournful lament, a melody layered with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. The crystalline statues began to tremble, their luminescence flickering. Then slowly, impossibly, they began to tore. Not with explosive disintegration, but with a gradual, mournful dissolution, as if the song itself was stripping them of their form, returning them to the silent, receptive wood. "It's feeding on the reality of the song," Kalen whispered, a terrifying understanding washing over him. "It doesn't just crave harmony. It craves what harmony. It wants to consume the entire concept of beauty, of order, of existence itself." The fate of Quel'Thalas, he realized, wasn't about silencing the song. It was about confronting it with the stark, undeniable truth of what had been lost. Chapter 9. Echoes of Loss. The air in the Grand Arboreum hung thick with a palpable grief, a silence heavier than the shifting shadows cast by the dying sunlight. The crystalline statues, once frozen in agonizing beauty, were now little more than shimmering ghosts, their light a fractured memory of their former selves. Kalen, his face etched with a weary horror, stared at the dissolving remains of a former archmage, a woman who had dedicated her life to the preservation of the Sunwell. The rhythmic tremor, a subtle pulse in the very stone beneath their feet, had subsided, replaced by a profound stillness that felt less like peace and more like the suffocating absence of something vital. "It doesn't want to be silenced," Lyra repeated, her voice a fragile thread against the vastness of the room. "It wants remembered." The realization, chilling in its implications, settled over them like a shroud. The hollow song wasn't a destructive force, it was a consuming one, an echo of a catastrophic event that had sought to rewrite reality itself. The initial attempts to shatter the statues with cold iron arrows, a desperate gamble suggested by Elder Morian, had been predictably futile. The arrows simply dissipated against the crystalline structure, as if the song itself was actively preventing their destruction. Now, as the statues dissolved, it was clear they weren't fighting a weapon, but a grief so potent it manifested as physical form. "We've been approaching this entirely wrong, Silas," the Sun-Fury Arcanist spoke, his usual zealous energy subdued. His hand rested on the hilt of his curved blade, a weapon had relied on for decades, now utterly useless. "We've been trying to destroy a sound. We need to understand the source of the sound, the trauma that birthed it." He turned his gaze to the ravaged heart of the Arboreum, a section of the ancient trees that had once pulsed with a vibrant, silvery light, now blackened and scarred, radiating a subtle, almost unbearable dissonance. The Void Star didn't simply the song. It's the echo of its destruction. It fed on the despair, the loss, the shattered dreams of Quel'Thalas. Kalen, drawing on his extensive knowledge of Elven lore and the fractured fragments of recovered texts, offered a grim assessment. The Sylvanesti were betrayed by the Star-Touched. Their attempt to harness the Void Star's energy for their own purposes resulted in a catastrophic rift, a wound in reality that unleashed not just destruction, but the raw, untamed recollection of that annihilation. The song isn't merely a symptom, it's the echo of the original wound. Lyra, ever the pragmatist, shifted her focus. The silence of the Starset's a desperate measure, a complete severing of connection. But if the song feeds on memory, perhaps we can starve it. Not by fighting its auditory manifestation, but by denying it the fuel it needs. The concept was unnerving. To willingly relinquish their magic, to become deaf to the world, felt like a horrifying surrender. But Kalen recognized the logic. The ritual requires complete vulnerability. It demands a conscious acceptance of oblivion, a willingness to allow the song to wash over us, utterly unheeded. It's not about silencing it, it's about becoming a null space, a void in its hunger. The preparations for the ritual were somber, conducted with a solemn reverence usually reserved for the death of a king. The remaining elves, a small contingent of rangers, arcanists, and warriors, lined the perimeter of the arboreum, their faces pale and drawn. They were to stand motionless, channeling the last vestiges of the Sunwell's energy not into offensive spells, but into a state of absolute receptive stillness. As they began the ritual, a collective breath held, a shared willingness to embrace the void. The air grew colder, denser. The fractured light of the dissolving statues intensified, coalescing into shimmering motes that danced around them like lost souls. The song, though diminished, continued to resonate, not with a jarring dissonance, but with a heartbreaking melody of loss, the lament of a fallen civilization, the whispers of shattered hopes. Then something shifted. Kalen, his senses honed by years of battle and the unnerving influence of the song, noticed a subtle alteration in the melody. It wasn't just a lament, it was questioning, a tentative reaching out, as if the song itself was attempting to communicate. "It's responding to us," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Not with aggression, but with something akin to curiosity. It's as if it's trying to understand our intent. Lyra, her own connection to the dwindling magic within her, confirmed his observation. It's acknowledging our presence, but it's still hungry. We need to offer it something more than mere oblivion. She raised her hand, her fingers tracing a slow, deliberate pattern in the air. We need to offer it truth. The final words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken significance. The fate of Quel'Thalas, it seemed, rested not on silencing a destructive force, but on confronting a ghost born of unimaginable loss, and desperately seeking to be remembered. Chapter 10. Echoes of Remembrance. The chill had deepened, a bone-cracking cold that settled not just on the skin, but within the marrow of their bones. The motes of solidified light, once swirling frenetically around them, now pulsed with a quieter, almost mournful rhythm, reflecting the shifting nature of the song itself. Kalen, despite the unsettling revelation, found himself gripped by a profound sense of weariness. The weight of Quel'Thalas, of its dying magic, and the growing, unnerving presence of this ethereal predator pressed heavily upon him. Lyra, ever the pragmatist, maintained a carefully constructed calm, her movements deliberate and precise as she continued to trace the intricate patterns in the air, a desperate attempt to shape the chaotic resonance of the song. "Truth," she repeated, the word a fragile offering to the void. "It's not enough to simply shut it down." The sing is built on the foundation of a civilization stripped bare. It craves what it's lost. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions, the reverberations of centuries of elven pride and regret. The original directive, the silence of the stars, felt increasingly inadequate, a blunt instrument against a foe that operated on a level far removed from their comprehension. "We've been approaching this as a military problem," Kalen said, his voice low and strained. "A disruption to be neutralized. But the song isn't a weapon, it's a repository. It's a grief given form." He shifted his gaze to the most recent statue, a young Sun-Fury Arcanist, frozen mid-spell, her face a mask of serene yet profound sorrow. Each of these solidified memories, they amplify the song, but they also were not just silencing a voice, were feeding a hunger. Lyra acknowledged his observation with a curt nod. The core of the problem isn't the song itself, but the of it. The Void Star didn't simply emit this dissonance, it channeled the despair of a world consumed by hubris and self-destruction. She paused, her expression darkening. "We've been so focused on preserving Quel'Thalas, on clinging to the remnants of our glory, that we've forgotten to understand the forces that brought us to this point." Suddenly, a subtle shift occurred within the ritual. The air thickened, not with cold, but with an unnerving clarity. as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a landscape previously obscured by magical distortion. The motes of light intensified, no longer swirling, but coalescing into distinct shapes, ghostly images of elves engaged in moments of joy, sorrow, and most chillingly, of bitter conflict. They weren't merely representations of loss, they were. "It's showing us," Kalen whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the pommel of his Silverleaf blade. "It's showing us the fall." The images were not continuous, but fragmented, flashes of key moments in Quel'Thalas history, the betrayal at the hands of the Titans, the catastrophic breach of the Sunwell, the subsequent exodus to this forsaken realm. But interspersed amongst these historical echoes were scenes of everyday elven life, children laughing, lovers whispering, scholars debating moments of beauty and connection tragically cut short. As they witnessed these glimpses of the past, a strange resonance began to build within Kalen. He wasn't experiencing a purely sensory input. It was as if he was the emotions of those who had lived and died in those moments. The despair, the fear, the burning rage all flooded him with a raw intensity. It wants to be remembered, he realized, his voice choked with emotion. It wants us to acknowledge not just the destruction, but the that was extinguished. Lyra, her face pale but resolute, stepped forward. Then we must offer it a proper remembrance. Not through silence, but through a song of our own. She raised her hands once more, this time not tracing patterns in the air, but shaping a harmonic chord using her voice, a mournful, haunting melody drawn from the oldest Elven ballads, a lament for the fallen. It wasn't a spell, not in the traditional sense. It was a prayer, a genuine attempt to connect with the entity on its own terms. As she sang, the song responded. It didn't change its tune, but it shifted in timbre, becoming richer, less fractured, laced with a strange sense of recognition. The motes of light pulsed in time with her voice, and the solidified statues, for the first time, seemed to tremble slightly. "It's not rejecting us," Kalen observed, his voice laced with wonder. "It's listening." The fate of Quel'Thalas, Kalen realized, was inextricably linked to this final desperate act of empathy. It wasn't about severing their connection, but about forging a new one. A connection built not on negation, but on remembrance. The cold iron arrows lay ready, still a potential solution, but now they felt like a brutal, inadequate finality. The question wasn't just about silencing the song, but about understanding its sorrow, and perhaps finding a way to finally lay it to rest. Chapter 11. Echoes of Resonance. The air in the great grove hung thick with a strange stillness. The silence amplified, not by absence, but by an almost palpable awareness. The crystalline statues, still arranged in the grotesque choreography of the hollow song's influence, seemed less like monuments to loss, and more like echoes of a conversation halted mid-breath. Lyra continued her song, a slow, deliberate weaving of notes, her voice deepening with each phrase, imbued with a depth of sorrow that resonated through the very stone of Quel'Thalas. Kalen stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the haft of a cold iron arrow, a silent testament to the grim option that still lingered. He watched the motes of light, once chaotic and unsettling, now responded with a hesitant, almost cautious rhythm, mirroring the contours of her vocalization. The shift wasn't immediate, not a dramatic cessation of the dissonant pulse. Instead, it was a subtle recalibration, like a tuning fork finding its precise frequency. The fractured aspects of the song, the jagged edges of its horror, seemed to soften, losing some of their violent sting. It still throbbed with a melancholic energy, but now, interspersed within the distortion, were notes of something else. Something akin to recognition, perhaps even a tentative yearning. The vibrations. "They're not just chaotic," murmured Elara, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, her usually vibrant violet eyes now clouded with a contemplative intensity. "They're responding to the song, to the emotion we're channeling." She adjusted the focusing lens of her ocular prism, painstakingly analyzing the shifting patterns of light, a small, intricate device that usually belched forth arcane energy, now simply observed. Kaelin understood her. The initial impulse, the almost frantic solution of severing magic, had been predicated on a fundamental misunderstanding. The song wasn't an active malice, a malevolent force to be eradicated. It was a wound, a concentrated agony, feeding on the absence of acknowledgement, on the denial of the profound loss it represented. Lyra's song, born of genuine grief and a desperate desire for connection, was not a weapon, but an offering. "The ritualists believed it demanded silence," Kaelin said, his voice low, careful. "But silence, in this context, only fueled its hunger. It thrived on our fear of acknowledging the beauty that was consumed." He gestured to the statues with a hand, a silent plea for understanding. "They are not simply frozen in horror. They are frozen in the shade and aviuanmoius, and how." A hush fell over the assembled elves. The few remaining warriors, their faces etched with the exhaustion of weeks spent battling the song's influence, lowered their weapons, their movements deliberate, respectful. Even the ancient dryads, usually guardians of impassivity, shifted their leafy limbs in a gesture of what could only be interpreted as solemn attention. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the grove, not violent, but profound, as if the very ground was sighing. The motes of light intensified, coalescing into a swirling vortex around Lyra's form. She didn't falter, her voice continuing its mournful lament, the notes now richer, imbued with a subtle, almost iridescent quality. The crystalline statues shuddered violently, the shards of frozen magic within them pulsing with a blinding white light. Then, one by one, they began to, not with the jerky rhythmic compulsion of the song, but with a slow, deliberate grace. They unfolded like blossoming flowers, the crystallized magic dissolving into shimmering dust that drifted upwards, carried on the newly formed currents of air. Each movement was accompanied by a corresponding shift in Lyra's song, as if she was not just singing the song but with it. As the last statue collapsed into a fine, silvery powder, a single, clear note resonated through the grove, a note of breathtaking beauty. A pure, untainted echo of the Sunwell's original song. It wasn't a triumphant sound, but one of profound peace, of acceptance. Kaelin instinctively reached for the cold iron arrow, his fingers tightening on its smooth, unforgiving surface. But he hesitated. He looked at Lyra, her face radiating a serene, almost luminous light, and he saw not madness, but a profound act of courage, a willingness to confront not just a destructive force, but the enduring weight of loss. "The arrow's still a viable option," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I believe we found a more elegant solution." He turned to the remaining elves, his gaze sweeping across their faces, a silent communication passing between them. "Let us remember," he commanded, his voice carrying in newfound authority. "Let us remember. Not as a burden, but as a foundation for a new song, a song of healing, a song of remembrance, a song that finally allows the echoes of the hollow song to find their rest." The response was immediate. The remaining elves began to sing, a chorus of voices weaving together, a tapestry of sorrow and hope, a testament to their resilience, their empathy, and their profound understanding of the tragic beauty of what they had lost. The final vestiges of the hollow song faded, replaced by the whispered promise of a new dawn, born not of negation, but of resonance. Chapter 12. Resonance. The air in the grove of Silverleaf hung thick with the scent of damp moss, and something else entirely as subtle, almost metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. The initial panic, the frenzied crystallizations, had subsided, replaced by a grim, deliberate calm. Lyra. Her hands still stained with the silvery residue of the corrupted magic, moved amongst the remaining elves, a silent sentinel of observation and careful direction. Kalen, his face etched with a weary seriousness, oversaw the final preparations for the silence of the stars, a movement imbued with an unsettling gravity. The clearing, once dominated by the terrifying rhythmic pulse of the hollow song, was now a space of brittle beauty. The trees themselves seemed to hold their breath, the leaves still shimmering with residual light, but muted, hesitant. The crystalline statues, 12 in total, remained frozen mid-gesture, their faces masks of serene, unnatural stillness. They were not victims anymore, they were instruments, waiting to be deployed. "The calibrations are complete," reported Master Eldrin, his voice a low rumble, his silver hair reflecting the pale light. "The focusing lenses are aligned. We can generate a localized harmonic resonance, just sufficient to physically manifest the song within the crystalline structures. Once contained, the arrows will have the necessary force." Kalen nodded, his gaze fixed on the statues. "Let's not romanticize this, Eldrin. We are not composing a lament. We are extinguishing a plague." Lyra approached, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the methodical efficiency of the other elves. "Sentiment, Lord Kalen, is a luxury we can ill afford. We are dealing with something that feeds on the very essence of beauty, of emotion. To approach this with cold, detached logic is, ironically, the only way to truly honor those who were lost." Her words carried a weight of profound sorrow. The crystallizations had taken so much, not just life, but the potential for joy, for growth, for the continued blossoming of Quel'Thalas. It was a grief that threatened to drown them, and Kalen recognized the necessity of her pragmatism. The ritual began with a haunting crescendo. Eldrin, with a gesture of his hand, activated the lenses. They shimmered, casting fractured rainbows across the clearing, and a wave of energy far subtler than the preceding cacophony rippled outwards. It wasn't a song, not exactly. It was a vibrational signature, a complex pattern of pressure and distortion that seemed to writhe in the air. The crystalline statues responded, their frozen forms subtly shifting, the silver within them pulsing with an unholy light. "The resonance is building," whispered Theron, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, his brow furrowed with concentration. "The song is attempting to re-establish its influence. We need to maintain the focus." The elves began to sing. Not a triumphant anthem, but a slow, deliberate weaving of voices. It wasn't a song of remembrance, as Kalen had initially envisioned. Instead, it was a layering of sounds, a deep drone from the older mages, the high-pitched harmonics of the Sun-Fury clan, the delicate, melancholic melodies from the wardens. They weren't trying to counter the hollow song directly. They were attempting to build a counter-vibration designed to disrupt the corrupted harmony. It was a profoundly unsettling experience. The combined voices felt not like an act of solace, but like an act of profound surrender. As the sound grew, the silvery powder within the crystalline statues intensified, flowing outwards in intricate patterns like liquid mercury. The pressure in the air increased, becoming almost tangible. "It's working!" exclaimed Eldrin, his voice strained. "The resonance is amplifying. The song is contained." Kalen felt a sharp, instinctive pang of regret. He hadn't wanted this. Had wanted a decisive, brutally efficient solution. Yet, watching the carefully orchestrated symphony of sorrow, he understood Lyra's reasoning. Violence in this context would only perpetuate the cycle of corruption. This wasn't about destroying the song, it was about forcing it into a form that could be neutralized. With a final resounding note from the chorus, the crystalline cores within the statues began to glow with an unbearable intensity. Kalen raised his hand, signaling the launch. The wardens, their faces grim, stepped forward, each drawing back an arrow tipped with meticulously crafted cold iron. The air crackled with energy. "For Quel'Thalas," they cried, releasing the arrows. They were not weapons of destruction, but of precise harmonic disruption. The arrows struck the glowing cores with surgical accuracy, shattering the crystalline structures with a sound like splintering ice. The silvery powder vanished, dispersed by the force of the impact. The localized vibration ceased, and the grove breathed again, a relieved sigh echoing through the ancient trees. Silence descended, profound and absolute. Kalen looked at Lyra, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. The loss remained, a gaping wound in the heart of Quel'Thalas. But now, at least, there was a chance for a new song, a song not of mourning, but of resilience, forged in the ashes of the hollow song. Chapter 13. Echoes of the Silent Grove. The silence in the grove was a thing of unbearable weight. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but a palpable void, a vacuum born of a force that had once consumed all harmony. Kalen, Ranger Lord of Quel'Thalas, stood with Lyra, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, amidst the scattering of silvery dust, the remnants of the shattered crystalline cores. The air still held the faintest tremor, a ghost of the hollow song's insidious pulse, a testament to the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The initial rush of adrenaline, a desperate urgency born of witnessing a legion of their kin transform into unmoving sculptures of sorrow, had given way to a profound, almost debilitating quietude. The wardens, their faces etched with a grim satisfaction that bordered on solemn reverence, lowered their cold iron arrows, their movements slow and deliberate, as if afraid to break the fragile peace. "It's quiet," Lyra said, her voice hushed, almost reverent. She ran a gloved hand over a patch of moss, its vibrant green now subtly muted by the lingering effect of the song. "Too quiet." Kalen nodded. The regret Head felt during the operation, the ingrained instinct for decisive violence, still a knot in his stomach. He hadn't anticipated the exquisite, almost agonizing, nature of their victory. The ritual was precise. The warden's understanding of harmonics remarkable. He glanced at Master Theron, a veteran warden whose face held the accumulated sorrow of 1,000 battles, and a flicker of something resembling pride crossed the older elf's features. The immediate aftermath demanded careful observation. They established a perimeter, utilizing meticulously placed wards not of raw magic, but of resonant frequencies, designed to detect the slightest residual tremor of the hollow song. The shimmering leaves of the Quel'Thalas trees, once vibrant with the echoes of the Sunwell, seemed to hold their breath, reflecting the gray light of the fading day with a mournful stillness. The song, it wasn't simply destructive, Lyra murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't about corrupting magic. It was on it, like a parasite draining the lifeblood from a host. She adjusted the delicate instruments strapped to her wrist, arcane sensors designed to analyze the remaining vibrational signatures. The crystals themselves weren't the source of the corruption. They were merely conduits, amplifying the song's influence. The core was a receiver, a physical manifestation of its power. Kalen considered this. The initial reaction of the mages, the chaotic, uncontrolled outbursts of power, suggested a corrupted connection to the Sunwell, but Lyra's analysis painted a far more unsettling picture. So, by forcing it into a localized vibration, we disrupted its reception. We starved it. Precisely, Lyra confirmed. The key wasn't destruction, but redirection. The arrows, tipped with cold iron, weren't meant to shatter the cores with brute force. They were designed to the harmonic alignment, to introduce a dissonant frequency that overloaded the song's receiving capacity. She paused, her gaze fixed on the crumbling remains of a statue, a young elven mage, frozen mid-incantation, a single perfect tear tracing a path down his cheek. It was a brutal, elegant solution, like silencing a particularly insistent note on a grand organ. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustle of leaves and the soft hum of Lyra's instruments. Caelan knew that the task wasn't truly complete. The remnants of the hollow song lingered, a subtle stain on the fabric of Quel'Thalas. The recovery would be a slow, painstaking process, requiring not just physical remediation, but a fundamental shift in their understanding of magic, of their connection to the land, and perhaps most profoundly, to themselves. "We've bought ourselves time," Caelan said, his voice carrying a note of grim determination. "Time to understand the nature of this void star and its song. Time to heal." He looked at the wardens, their faces etched with a quiet resolve. "But we cannot afford complacency. The song's influence is not extinguished, it's merely dormant. It will seek another resonance, another vessel." Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting the gray light. "The Sunwell is weakened, but not broken. We must reinforce its connection to the grove, reinforce our own connection to its magic. We must learn to listen, not just to the song of the woods, but to the song." Caelan took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and ancient wood filling his lungs. The loss would forever be a shadow cast over Quel'Thalas, a stark reminder of their near annihilation. Yet, as he looked upon the resilient faces of his people, upon the quiet determination in Lyra's eyes, he felt a nascent hope blossom in the silence. The song of mourning might have ended, but the echoes of resilience and the promise of a new, carefully constructed melody had just begun to resonate. Chapter 14. The Weight of Absence. The rain in Quel'Thalas hadn't ceased, though it had shifted from a frenzied downpour to a persistent melancholic drizzle. It clung to the silverleaf branches, blurring the already muted colors of the forest, and settled on the faces of the elves gathered around the shattered remains of the Sunwell's outer ward. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone, ozone, and a faint, unsettling sweetness, a lingering echo of the song's corruption. Caelan, Warden's captain and ranger lord, stood closest to the central fissure, a jagged maw of fractured crystal where the protective barrier had once stood. His face was drawn, the light of his silver eyes etched with a fatigue deeper than mere exhaustion. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cold edges of a shard, tracing the intricate, chaotic patterns within remnants of the song's influence. "The wardens have secured the perimeter," he announced, his voice deliberately measured. "Movement within a 5-mile radius is restricted. We've established a layered watch, focusing on areas with residual crystalline structures. Lyra and her team are analyzing the composition of the stone, attempting to understand the precise mechanics of the song's propagation." Lyra, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, remained hunched over a meticulously crafted table, a chaotic arrangement of vials filled with iridescent fluids, slivers of the crystallized elves, and intricate diagrams rendered on polished slate. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic as she delicately manipulated a spectral scanner, its faint blue glow illuminating her intense concentration. She hadn't spoken since the final desperate volley of cold iron arrows, a palpable tension radiating from her. "The structure isn't purely harmonic," she finally said, her voice raspy. "It's structured chaos. The song isn't simply magic, it's actively it, forcing it into a pattern dictated by the void star's resonance. It's as if the Sunwell, in its weakened state, became a vulnerable receptor, broadcasting a signal that this thing exploited." A silence descended, broken only by the insistent drumming of the rain. The recovery efforts were slow, almost agonizingly so. The crystalline statues, frozen mid-gesture, mid-spell, were removed and taken for study, but their presence served as a constant, chilling reminder of the scale of the devastation. They weren't just bodies, they were instruments of the song's influence, silent witnesses to the elves' profound loss. "We're facing a problem beyond simple magical negation," Kalen observed, his gaze sweeping over the assembled wardens. "Traditional spells, even those designed to disrupt harmonic resonance, only amplify the song's power. We've been fighting a ghost with spells, and ghosts, as we've learned, are notoriously difficult to pin down." A young warden, Ilara, stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "Captain, with all due respect, shouldn't we be focusing on repairing the Sunwell? The healers believe the source of the corruption lies within its disrupted flow." Kalen considered her words, acknowledging the inherent wisdom of the proposition. "The Sunwell's stabilization is paramount, Ilara. However, attempting to force a connection with a corrupted source is akin to pouring poison into a wound. We need to understand the Sunwell was vulnerable, to address the root cause, not simply treat the symptoms." He turned back to Lyra. "What have you discovered about the Void Star's nature? Its resonance? Its purpose?" Lyra hesitated, her face grim. "It's a creature of entropy, Captain. A fragment of a star consumed by the void, driven solely by a hunger for harmony. Not beauty, not balance, merely the something. It's consuming the magic of Quel'Thalas, not with force, but with an insidious imitation, a seductive promise of completion." She paused, then added, a chilling note in her voice, "It feeds on silence." The implications of her words were stark. The silence of the stars, the ritual they had painstakingly researched, suddenly took on a terrifying significance. It wasn't merely a means of weakening the song. It was a deliberate act of self-removal, a temporary surrender to the void's influence. "The ritual is ready," Kalen announced, his voice firm. "We move at dawn. We'll begin with a small cohort, those willing to undergo the deafening." He deliberately used the euphemism, acknowledging the visceral revulsion most felt towards the concept. "The goal isn't to destroy the song, not directly. It's to break its hold on us, to sever its connection to the Sunwell, to create a localized vibration, a point of dissonance that the Void Star cannot sustain." He looked at the faces of his people, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "This is not an act of despair, but of profound strategic vulnerability. We must understand that true strength lies not in resisting the void, but in disrupting its song." As the last of the rain began to subside, a sliver of gray light pierced through the clouds, illuminating the shattered remains of the Sunwell. It was a fragile, mournful light, but amidst the silence, a single, tentative note of hope resonated, the quiet determination of a people learning to listen to the of song. Chapter 15. The weight of stillness. The rain had ceased, leaving Quel'Thalas draped in a suffocating, pearly silence. It wasn't the comforting hush of a healthy forest, it was a pregnant stillness, thick with dread and the residue of a corrupted harmony. The shard of the Sunwell, now an irregular, jagged ruin, pulsed with a mournful gray light, as if remembering a life it could never reclaim. Kalen, Ranger Lord of the Silverleaf, watched the sight with a weariness that settled deep in his bones, a counterpoint to the almost manic energy of the preparations. The small cohort, as Head called it, comprised 15 elves, mages, rangers, even a handful of seasoned warriors. Their faces, illuminated by the grim light, were etched with a discomfort that wasn't entirely born of fear. It was the profound, unsettling knowledge of what they were about to do, to willingly relinquish their connection to the source of their power, to embrace a deliberate, controlled silence. "Are you certain this is wise, Lord Kalen?" Lyra, the Sun-Fury Arcanist, asked, her voice a low tremor. She meticulously adjusted the straps of her intricately crafted cold iron bracers, each etched with protective glyphs, designed to mitigate the immediate effects of severing the magical flow. The reports. The mage is already lost to the song. It feels reckless. Kalen nodded, his gaze fixed on the shattered remnants of the Sunwell. Reckless, perhaps. But desperation necessitates choices. We've exhausted every magical countermeasure. Every incantation, every weaving of light has only strengthened the song's grip. To continue fighting with magic is to be consumed. He paused, the silence amplifying the weight of his words. We are not attempting to vanquish the void star, we are attempting to it. A single potent disruption, delivered in the precise key of absolute stillness. The deafening, as Head tactfully termed it, was a term they'd adopted. A chilling euphemism for the temporary neural suppression the ritual demanded. The process involved meticulously woven counter-incantations designed to physically block the pathways of magical resonance within the elves' minds. It wasn't simply a deprivation of magic. It was a controlled, targeted interruption of their very perception of the world. The theoretical physicist, Master Theron, believes the song operates on a principle similar to resonance. Kalen continued, his voice measured. It vibrates at a specific frequency, inextricably linked to the Sunwell's diminished energy. To interfere with that frequency, we must introduce a contrasting vibration, absolute stillness. It's a brutal paradox, isn't it? A flicker of understanding crossed the face of Master Theron, a grizzled veteran of countless arcane investigations. Indeed, he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. The Void Star is not simply a destructive force, it's a remarkably force. We're not silencing it, we're forcing it to play a discordant note. As the first rays of dawn painted the ruined Sunwell in shades of bruised violet, the cohort began their preparations. The air grew colder, heavier with the scent of ozone, and something else, something ancient and subtly unsettling, like the ghost of a forgotten symphony. The mages, led by Lyra, began reciting the counter-incantations, their voices a monotone drone that seemed to carve itself into the silence. Kalen watched as the initial signs of the ritual began to manifest, a subtle shimmering around the elves' eyes, a slight darkening of their skin, the faintest tremor in their hands. He recognized it, the beginning of the deafening, the faces of the warriors, hardened by years of conflict, contorted with a primal discomfort. One young ranger, Elara, gripped her cold iron bow so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her jaw clenched. Remember, Kalen's voice was firm, cutting through the drone. Focus. Resist the urge to react. Your minds must be blank canvases, receptive to the introduction of the dissonant vibration. The arrowheads must be aligned. Let us silence the song. As the last of the counter-incantations reached their crescendo, a visible wave of energy pulsed outward from the cohort, forming a shimmering field around them. The gray light of the Sunwell intensified, reacting to the disruption. Then, with a collective, almost imperceptible movement, each elf's eyes rolled back in their sockets, and a quiet, unnerving stillness descended upon them. They were no longer elves, but vessels of manufactured silence, their bodies radiating a palpable sense of emptiness. Kalen stepped forward, holding aloft a meticulously crafted, 15-meter-long spear fashioned from the purest cold iron. At its tip, a complex array of interlocking gears and crystalline resonators, a device designed to amplify the localized vibration. He took a deep, steadying breath, and with a single deliberate motion, hurled the spear towards the ruined Sunwell. The impact was not a crash, but a subtle shudder, a ripple in the air that echoed with an almost unbearable emptiness. The violet light fractured, and for a heartbeat, there was a terrifying, beautiful silence. Then, with a final, resonating groan, the crystalline core of the Sunwell shattered, showering the clearing with glittering fragments of gray. The oppressive weight of the hollow song lifted, replaced by the hesitant, tentative whisper of the wind through the Silverleaf forest, a whisper that felt